I am the youngest of 4 boys. We have no sisters. Now, there are benefits and there are drawbacks to being the youngest of 4 boys. The greatest benefit to being the youngest of 4 is not only do you get to learn from all your brother's mistakes, but by the time your parents get to you, the first 3 have so exhausted them, they are willing pretty much to let you parent yourself. Things that my older brothers were not allowed to do until they were 16 or 18, I was allowed to do at age 5 or 6. Just kidding. When I was 14, however, my parents left me home alone for 2 weeks while they went on a trip to Europe. Of course, I had half the congregation checking in on me while they were gone, but still 14 years old. Let's say I was on cruise control. The downside of being the youngest of 4 boys is, first, there ends up being very few pictures of you when you were a baby. My oldest brother had 900 pictures taken of him in the first week of his life. The earliest picture we have of me was my high school graduation. The other disadvantage of being the youngest of 4 boys is that the other 3 see you as open game. You become the outlet for their anger, frustration, bad grades, stress, broken hearts, poor judgment, and sadistic imagination. Often, these terroristic episodes would take place when I was left alone with one or more of my brothers who had been assigned to babysit me. I used to beg my mother for an out-of-the-family babysitter. I seldom got one. On one such episode, I'm often found of sharing this with my family when we have our family gatherings. It was the night when one of my brothers, who will remain nameless, was left to babysit me, and not long after my parents went out, my brother called me out to the backyard and pointed up to the sky to this bird that was flying around. It was a pretty large bird. It might have been a hawk or something, just sort of floating up in the sky, and my brother said, "You see that bird up there?" And I said, "Yes." He said, you see how it's flying in that very certain pattern? I said, "Yeah, I think so." He said, "Well, that pattern really tells us that that's not a bird. That's really the boogeyman. And I can tell that boogeyman is coming for you, and he's coming for you tonight." Well, I was about 5 years old at that point, young enough that I swallowed this hook, line, and sinker. And for the next couple of hours, as we sat in the house, whenever there was a sound, a creak, or a clank, my brother would suggest that was probably the boogeyman making his way for me. Then, of course, eventually bedtime came, and after I climbed into bed, my brother, as he was closing the door to my dark room, said, "Usually the boogeyman waits until you fall asleep before he comes. So if I don't see you in the morning, nice knowing you." So, of course, I lied there wide awake. Every sound in the house got louder and louder, and it meant to me that the boogeyman was getting closer and closer, and I begged and I prayed that God would be merciful. Finally, thank God, my parents came in the house, and I can remember my mother opening the door to check in on me, and so she could see me awake lying there, and she came and sat down on the side of my bed and I explained to her my brother's prophecy of the boogeyman. And she told me that there was no such thing as the boogeyman and that I had nothing to be afraid of. And I was glad for her words, but what I was more glad for was her presence. I was just so glad she was there. And so she asked if I wanted her to stay there until I fell asleep. And I said, "Would you?" And she did, and it felt so good to fall asleep in my mother's presence. It doesn't take a lot, and it most certainly doesn't take the truth to get us worried. I remember when I was a little older and went to see a movie with my family starring Audrey Hepburn called Wait Until Dark. Wait Until Dark has one of those popcorn-tossing scenes when someone leaps from the shadows unsuspectingly and the place screams. And when I got home, there was not a dark room I entered, there was not a closet I opened without being convinced that a dangerous stranger lurked and was ready to leap. The world can be a frightening place. From childhood on, we have been led to believe that there are monsters and creatures and boogeymen out there to get us. Sometimes they're real, but most of the time we know they're not. I once read of a survey that indicated that 40% of our time is spent worrying about things that never happen. 30% of our time is spent worrying about things that we can't change. 20% of our time is spent worrying over the misinterpretation of the comments of others. What did she mean when she said that? And 10% of our worry is over our own health, which only gets worse the more we worry. There is no magic age at which we cease lying awake in our beds, imagining the worst things that could happen. Half of us are worried about getting behind. The other half are worried that we're not far enough ahead. A pain in your side means a tumor. A dip in the market means your retirement is going to be meant you sleeping on a park bench. Your daughter asking for the car keys means you're going to get a call from the sheriff. The election might go against you, and now the world's going to end. The bird up in the air is not really a bird. It's the boogeyman. I read an article a while ago that reported the encouraging news about a study that indicated that a good night's sleep actually increases one's risk of a heart attack. The deeper you sleep, the more you dream, the faster your heart beats, the more chance you have of having a heart attack. What great news! The boogeyman is everywhere. It's the truth, isn't it? It doesn't take much to twist ourselves in knots over things real and unreal, to hear the voices that warn of ominous things to come, to lie awake wondering when is the next shoe going to drop. The Apostle Paul says, don't worry about anything, and we wonder what world could he be living in. Anxiety, it seems, is a way of life. Is that not the case for you? Add on top of that a global pandemic, an election, an unstable economy, and the uncertainty of the future, and you got yourself a recipe for being completely overwhelmed. Overwhelmed might be the word to use when describing this woman that Mark tells us about, the woman who is living out all of our worst fears. Maybe it might be more accurate to call her life a perfect storm. Not only is she unwell, not only can she not find a way to get better, not only does she get word from the doctors that they don't know what to do, not only has she emptied her bank account trying to find the answers, on top of all that, her illness was one of those illnesses that rendered her under the law unclean, untouchable, undesirable, unwelcome, unwanted. She was living out her worst fears, our worst fears. The boogeyman for her was not a joke. Not only does she not have the body, the resources, the medical attention she needs, this poor woman doesn't even have a friend. She has no one to touch and no one to touch her. She is a COVID patient in intensive care, pulled away from all who might be there to comfort her. Mark tells us that in the midst of this overwhelmness, in the midst of this perfect storm, in the midst of living out all of our worst fears, Mark tells us that she reached out and felt the presence. She reached out amidst the crushing crowd, through all those who could not help her, through all those who would not help her. She reached out in the midst of the pressing crowd, and she touched the presence of Jesus. She touched the hem of his robe, and Scripture says that she felt in her body that she was being healed. And Jesus turns to her and says, you reached into the presence. You touched the fringe of my presence, and your faith has made you well. You reached into the presence. You reached into the fringe of my presence, and your faith has made you well. John, the gospel writer, says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. And the apostle says, glory is of the only Son from the Father, and the glory comes from the presence, and the presence brings the healing. The presence takes on the burden. Cast all your anxiety on him, 1 Peter says, because he cares for you. He opens the door into the dark room of your worry, sits at the edge of the bed, and says, reach into my presence. Rest in my presence. Come unto me, and you will find rest for your souls. Joy Davidman Gresham, the woman whom C.S. Lewis married later in his life, had been in a previous season of her life a far ways away from sensing the presence of God. A child prodigy who had attended Hunter College in New York City at the age of 14, who shared a prestigious poetry prize at the age of 23 with Robert Frost, who reveled in her associations with the Communist Party, and who took pride in her atheism. But then life turned against her. Her husband's life began to fall apart. The challenges of motherhood got to be too much. And when finally she got a call one afternoon from her husband who said he was having likely a nervous breakdown and that he wasn't coming back home, and hung up, it was then that she had reached the end of her rope. She wrote, "For the first time in my life, I felt helpless. For the first time, my pride was forced to admit that I was not, after all, the master of my fate, the captain of my soul. All my defenses, the walls of arrogance and cocksureness and self-love behind which I had hid from God, went down momentarily, and God came in. That night, there was a person with me in the room, directly present to my consciousness, a person so real that all my previous life was by comparison mere shadow play, and I myself was more alive than I had ever been. It was like waking from sleep. I saw myself as I really was, with dismay and repentance, and seeing, I changed. I think I might have been the world's most astonished atheist." You who live in the shelter of the Most High, who abide in the shadow of the Almighty, will someday say to the Lord, "My refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust." Remember when Jesus comes to visit Mary and Martha, and Mary is banging around in the kitchen getting dinner ready for Jesus, and Mary, her sister, is sitting at Jesus' feet listening to him teach, and Martha comes out of the kitchen all hot and bothered and ticked off that her sister isn't helping, and Jesus says, "Martha, you're worried and distracted. You're worried and distracted by many things. There's need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." Mary knows that she's in the presence. I wonder if I'm not a lot like Martha, banging around in the kitchen, getting all hot and bothered by life, worried and distracted by many things, watching the news, scrolling my Twitter feed, checking the stock market, and I wake at 3 a.m. and wonder and convince myself that the perfect storm is brewing around me. COVID, the economy, the election, who will be the next president, that there seems this perfect storm, but right on the other side of the door is the presence of God. Actually, right on this side of the door is the presence of God. And it's not the storm that's perfect. It's Jesus who's perfect. There is no perfect storm because there is one whom even the waves and the wind obey. Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is in your midst." The presence of Christ is right here. And the invitation is to sit at Jesus' feet. Right within reach is the chance to bring an end to my anxiety. Because, I'm wondering if it might not just be true that we don't have to live such anxious lives. It may be that our lives will be hard, and our lives will be complex, and yes, our lives will be painful, and our lives will be uncertain, and our lives right now are even devoid of the touch that we so desire between two human beings. But still, there's the presence, the fringe of the presence. The place where no boogeyman can touch you. Jesus said, "Oh, in this world you will have trouble, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." Cast all your anxiety on him, for he cares for you.